Hey, g'day, it's Presso. Thanks for joining me in the workshop today. Now, today's video is all about glass cutting. Now, part of the reason for this is that I need to make 20 pieces of glass to fit inside these little garden lights that I've been making. So I thought you might as well see how to go about it. Now, you may also be thinking, well, hang on, what are your qualifications? So I'm not going to watch this if you have no credentials. Well, the thing is, back in 1990, I was given 2 lead light panels by my grandfather. Now, these are very old, they're probably about 100 years old today, and they look great, but I wanted 3 more of them to complete an entry set to go around the front door of the house. Now, the only way to do that was to make 3 new ones, so I enrolled in an 8-day lead lighting course at a local technical college, and during that time I learned the fundamentals of cutting glass, cutting lead, joining it, doing the grouting, and all of those skills that you need for lead lighting. Now, also over a number of years after that, I used to teach a unit at school where we would make mirrors with a wooden frame. They had stained glass edges and the glass was joined together using a copper foil technique. So I've got some background in it and not an expert, but you might as well see how it's done. So just to show you, these are the 2 lead light panels that I was given by my grandfather, and here are the 3 that go on the top of the door. Now, in order to do this, I had to be able to match the style, the colours and the textures of the glass, and also I had to be able to replicate that look so that it was hard to tell which were the originals and which were the copies. But in all, I think they turned out really good, and if you stood back and look at it, you wouldn't really know which were the new ones. Now, speaking of qualifications, this reminds me of a story. Now, when I was teaching every year, just before awards night, we were asked to submit a list of our qualifications. Now, this was just in case someone had lost their mind and decided to go off and do a doctorate or a master's degree, and they would have the most current list. Now, year after year, I would just put the same qualification in, which was Certificate of Teaching. That's all I ever got. So it was just Cert Teach. And a friend of mine had a mate who decided he was going to add a qualification. So he put in his normal Diploma of Education, and then after that he added FCDL. Now, the school would publish this every year in the program, and nobody ever questioned it. And then one day, out of the blue, one of the administrators, who had a bit more nous than all the rest, approached him and said, can you tell me what this FCDL thing is? I've never heard of it. And he said, yeah, sure, it's First Class Driver's License. So it just goes to show you, you can sort of get away with things quite easily sometimes, but it did eventually catch up to him. Okay, the glass that I'm cutting today is just ordinary 4mm float glass. Now, this is just what you'd put in the windows in your house. You can also, using these same tools I'll show you, you can also cut plate glass, but not toughened glass. You can also cut textured glass. Now, these are some examples of the type of glass you might use for lead lighting. Now, these textured glasses generally have a smooth side and a textured side. When you're doing this process, you need to cut on the smooth side. This one here has some undulations in this surface here, but underneath is very heavily textured. So you need to try and cut on the smoothest side possible on the glass. Okay, now as far as tools go, the most basic one is a straight edge. Now, you can buy these from lead lighting suppliers, you can get them on eBay, but these are designed specifically for cutting glass. Now, they have a thick edge, around about 4mm thick, and they also have a thin edge, it's only about 1mm thick, and on the back there's a piece of resilient rubber set into a channel. And the purpose of that is that when you press down, the rubber grips on the glass and it doesn't slide around quite so much. Now, you don't have to use one of these. You could just use a piece of wood or a strip of steel or aluminium or plastic, but it needs to be rigid enough to retain its shape. It needs to be straight, obviously. The ones you buy for lead lighting will have a scale on them so you can measure, and they come in various lengths. This one here is 600 millimeters long. So you need a straight edge. The next thing you'll need is a glass cutter. Now, this is a medium quality glass cutter. You can buy these on eBay. I just checked, they cost around about 50 to 60 Australian dollars, and they have a carbide wheel which is very small in diameter. This one's only about 4mm diameter, it has a fairly obtuse angle on the cutting edge of the wheel. The cutting edge is around about 120 degrees, and there are different angles of wheel depending on the thickness of glass that you want to cut. Now these also have an oil reservoir in the handle. So the cutting head slides out like so. There's a brass tube in there, and there's a chamber into which you can put some light sewing machine oil or kerosene or a mixture of both. There's an O-ring on the bottom of the cutting head which stops the oil leaking down the outside, and there's an internal passageway that leads to the axle or the pivot point where the wheel sits. Now these are designed to be a little bit leaky, so as you're using it there's a constant flow of that oil down to the axle or the pivot point for the wheel. Now I'll talk in a minute about why we need the oil. Now the cutter has a handle designed for a grip that works like that. So the idea is you place it in between your middle finger and index finger and grip it with your thumb on the side, and that allows you to put a lot of pressure on the cutting wheel as you draw the glass cutter along. Now I don't use it that way. I hold it like a pen or a pencil, and that works for me, but the purists will tell you that that's how you should grip it. Alright, on the other end of the glass cutter there's a brass spherical knocker, and this is used for starting a fracture in the glass, and I'll demonstrate that later, but they are made of brass and they had that very specific purpose. I always thought it was just a decorative thing, but it's not. Okay, so that's our glass cutter. The other thing you will need is a pair of, or you may not need these depending on what you're doing. If you're doing straight cuts, you probably don't need these, but these are called grozing pliers. That's spelled G-R-O-Z-I-N-G. These are made of soft steel. They have a straight jaw and a curved jaw. And when you place the ends of the jaws together, they meet at a single point. So you can see how that joins up at the end there. Now these are designed for nibbling away at glass or for holding very thin strips of glass so you can fracture them off the edge of the bigger sheet. The reason they're softened is that they're a little bit less likely to chip the glass when you carry out that process. So they're the grozing pliers. They're spring loaded, by the way, and once again you can buy these on eBay. They're readily available. Another thing you might need is a very fine Sharpie, just for marking your glass. Now for what I'm doing today, I'm doing straight cuts. If you're doing lead lighting, you generally make a pattern, and it's called a cartoon. It goes under the glass and it will have a thick black Sharpie mark which shows you the thickness of the lead at the joints. In my case I don't need that because I'm just doing these straight cuts. Now this is the size of glass that I need to cut today. Now these have to be very precisely measured for width and length because they have to fit inside a piece of aluminium tubing. Now if you're doing lead lighting, you get a bit more wriggle room with the sides of the glass because of the depth of the groove in the lead cane. But for what I'm doing today, I need to be fairly precise. The glass needs to come out that size or slightly less. If it's oversized, it just won't fit. So I'm going to put this on the glass and I'm going to mark with my Sharpie just 2 points. So here are my marks. I need to be able to cut on the inside, on the left-hand edge of those 2 black marks there. Now, I mentioned before about the glass cutter and the oil. Now, the oil serves 3 main functions. Firstly, it lubricates the pivot point that that carbide wheel sits on. The second one is it flushes away any shards of glass that get built up around the wheel. Now, the glass that we're going to cut produces tiny, tiny powdered shards of glass, and they build up around that wheel there. The oil just simply helps to flow those away from the cut area. Now the oil serves another function as well. Now this is one I learned about. I was reading a trade magazine one day in a glass supplier's office, and it had micro photographs of what happens during the cutting process. Here's a picture of what you would be able to see if you could look directly at the edge of the glass as you're cutting it. Now the carbide wheel doesn't really cut the glass at all. What it does is it fractures the glass into a series of connected micro fractures, and they can be roughly 1/8 to 1/3 the thickness of the glass depending on how thick the glass is. And glass is one of those really weird materials that's a semi-liquid. And when those fractures occur, they will try to heal up again. Now what the oil does is it floods into those microfractures and it helps to hold them open. Now if you were to score the glass and then wait a couple of weeks and then try to fracture it, a lot of those little microfractures will have closed up and healed up, and you would find it very hard to get a clean fracture in the glass. So that's the other reason we would use that light oil on our glass cutter. Now, the technique for doing this is you place your straight edge up against those marks. You need to allow for the width of that glass cutter head. Now this one's about 6 millimeters wide, so the score line is going to be half that width, so roughly 3 millimeters. So what we have to do is to put our glass cutter up against that Sharpie mark and adjust our straight edge so that the wheel will be just on the inside of it. So this, in my case, is very critical. Okay, then you spread your fingers and your thumb out along the straight edge and you're ready to actually start scoring the glass. Now, there are a number of rules for doing this. The first one is that you cannot stop. So once you start, you've got to commit and actually run the glass cutter down the full length of the glass from edge to edge. If you pause or stop, you'll get a break in the score line and then the glass won't fracture cleanly from one end to the other. So that's the first thing. Don't stop. Second one is you've got to keep a consistent pressure on the glass cutter as you draw it along the straight edge, and you've got to push the edge of the cutter head in against the edge of the straight edge. So you've got to keep some sideways tension on your arm to keep the glass cutter running against that straight edge. Next one is you need to keep a consistent speed, and like I say, you just got to commit and get going. So let me demonstrate this one. I hope it works. I'm just going to have a bit of a practice to make sure none of my fingers are in the way. Righto, so we're going to stand the glass cutter up at an angle of about 60 to 70 degrees to make sure that the wheel is in contact with the glass, and away we go. Now what you should hear is sort of a hissing sound as you run the glass cutter along there, and you should be able to see the score line quite clearly, and it should be straight and continuous. If there are any gaps at all, it's not going to fracture along that line. Now I don't know if you can see that. The score line is very, very faint, but I'm hopeful that this is going to cut cleanly. Alright, let me show you a close-up of this end. Now here is our score line. Now if you're a beginner, what you might like to do is to get the brass ball on the end of your glass cutter and start tapping the glass from underneath. Now what this does is it gets a thing called a run going. Alright, now you can see that little fracture. Now that was caused by me tapping underneath with the ball on the glass cutter. Now that's got the fracture started through the full thickness of the glass, and that allows us then to actually continue that score mark all the way along. Okay, now what we need to do is to basically bend the glass, or attempt to bend it. Now I do it by putting my two fingers, the knuckles of the first two fingers, underneath the glass either side of the score mark, thumbs on top, and then what you do is you roll your wrists outwards. And you've got to, once again, you've got to be confident and commit to it. And that's what you get. So there's one strip. I'm going to do another couple. We'll get the camera on a different angle and we'll have another go. Okay, let's do another one. So I've already got this lined up, and away you go. Now when you've had a bit of practice, you don't need to do that thing with tapping underneath the glass to get the run started. So remember, just commit to it and just bend the glass away from that score line. Like I say, after a bit of practice, you'll be surprised how confident you become, and it will just become natural, and you'll just score, cut, and you can do that all day long. Now I want to be sure this is going to fit inside my tubing. So you can see that slides in there quite nicely. But if that was even slightly oversized, I'm going to be in trouble. It's not going to fit. Okay, I'm going to do a couple more and then we'll cut them into shorter lengths. Now, that one didn't sound good. Let me do this one by tapping. All the way up, tapping as you go. And you see that fracture line developing. It's up to about here now. I'll go a bit further. That's about 3/4 of the length of the glass now. And sometimes when you flex it, you can hear it crackling as that fracture opens up. Now this one's going to be a challenge because we're going to end up with a very skinny bit along this edge here, and that's where we may need to use our grazing pliers. So I'll try and do one more. Of course my problem now is it's very hard to grip onto that with just that much glass on the edge of the score, and if I was really confident I'd do that, but I'm not, so I'm just going to tap that. I want to get that run going up that length of that glass there. Now sometimes when you're doing this, the glass will just fall apart. Alright, that fracture has gone all the way along the glass now. And what I can do is just get my grazing pliers and grab it close to the fracture line and just put a bit of pressure on it. And it doesn't want to go. There it is. Now, right up here, we've got a very, very sharp shard of glass that has protruded out the side of that. Now, this is where your grazing pliers can help. So I'm going to get you in a bit closer and we'll have a look at that and we'll see how we can fix it. So you can see that little razor sharp edge of glass there protruding out from the side. If I turn that over you can see it more clearly, and because of that, that glass will not fit inside that aluminium tubing. So I've got to either grind that off using a diamond grinding wheel, or I can use the grazing pliers. Now the grazing pliers will leave a sort of a rough edge on it, but we can get rid of that. So let's have a look. So you might be able to see the problem there. That's not going to go in the way it is now. So with our grazing pliers, what we'll do is we'll just sort of nibble away at that edge. So you put the tip of the pliers on the top edge of the glass. This is on the side where the glass protrudes the most, and you just simply crunch away at it. Now when you're doing this, it makes tiny little pieces of razor sharp glass fracture and spread all over the place, so best to wear some sort of eye protection when you're doing this. And that's pretty much got rid of that. But you can see it doesn't look particularly pretty on the edge there. But we'll see if it fits. Right, now it's still not going in. Actually, it's not much better at the other end. It's sort of going most of the way. What I'll do with this one is I'll cut it to length first, and then we'll try and fit each piece individually. Now this is the very specific problem that I have, that this needs to be able to slide inside this tubing. Now if you were doing normal LED lighting, you wouldn't have such a tight tolerance normally. You can get away with 0.1, 0.2 millimeter over or under size, but with this, that's just physically not going to go in there. So one way of dealing with that is to grind one of those edges, and this is a 400 grit diamond hone, and I can just simply run that along there. And you may be able to see that it's starting to take off the high spots. And I just keep doing that till it fits. And that's very, very close. So I'll do the other edge as well. This is just very slightly damp. And that now fits in there. So this is a good way of actually removing any of those little sharp protrusions that you get on the edge of the glass there. Also makes it a bit safer to handle because those little shards that stick out from the side there are razor sharp and they'll cut you open, no trouble at all. So here's the one that I used with the grazing pliers before, and you see it's got that nasty edge on it. And it just smooths out any of those little imperfections in the edge of the glass. So that one, very close. And that now fits. Now you might just say, well, why don't you just cut it way smaller and it'll fit in there, but I don't want to be able to do that. I'm going to etch a pattern on the glass and it needs to register with the window in the front of that tubing. Now, in case you're wondering, you can cut curves in glass, but it does require a different technique. So you would have to have a line, curved line, either under the glass on a piece of paper, or you would have to have the line on the top surface of the glass marked in something like a Sharpie. And you've got to take your time. You've got to follow around that curve more carefully, but it's still possible. So just to give you some idea, I'm just going to cut across here in a sort of an S shape. Not really an S, but you get the idea. And if I was to just grab that and lift it like I did before, it may not necessarily follow that score mark. So this is where you use the brass ball on the end of the glass cutter. Just go along and get a run started. I don't know if you can hear that, but the note changes as the fracture comes along underneath the glass. And if you look through, you can see that fracture progressing about 3/4 of the way along that curve. Now the danger point is up here. It's most likely going to try and take a shortcut and come out through the edge of the glass and not follow the curve. See how we go. Now I'm just going to fracture this. It'll probably not follow the curve. Ah, it did. So yes, it did follow the curve. Alright, so yes, you can cut curves. Let's try another one. Let's try something a little bit more complex. Alright, same technique. Once again, you can see that fracture. Let's try breaking that. So again, that's followed that curve quite well. Alrighty, well that's it. That's how you cut glass, or at least that's an introduction to the topic. Now in the next video, I'm going to take this stack of glass and I'm going to try out 2 different decorative processes. And at the end of that, I have to make a decision about which one of those I carry on to this project here. So join me for that. Now I also said that I would introduce you to a new YouTube channel, or at least new to me, and I still want to do that, but I'll hold it over till the next video. I realized I wasn't going to fit this glass cutting tutorial into the project I'm working on now, so I've split it into 2. But yeah, join me because I think this new channel, new to me, this new channel to me is well worth seeing. So please join me for that. That's the end of today's video. thanks for watching. Let's come and hang out in the workshop again, and I'll catch up with you then. All right, it's Prezzo signing out.